The phone rang at 3 a.m. Labor has started. Come to the hospital immediately. My wife Sarah was trembling with excitement. We waited at the hospital for hours. Then the nurse came. Which birth are you waiting for? There are no deliveries tonight. Maria had disappeared with our $50. My name is David Chun. I'm 39 years old, and I just experienced what should have been the most joyful moment of our lives, turning into the most devastating betrayal imaginable. But what we discovered about Maria Rodriguez and Happy Family Adoptions would prove that our heartbreak was just one piece of a much larger criminal operation that had been systematically destroying families' dreams for years. Standing in the maternity ward of St. Mary's Hospital at 4:30 a.m., holding my sobbing wife, while a confused nurse explained that no births were scheduled that night, I felt our world collapse completely. We'd been preparing for this moment for 8 months, believing we were finally going to become parents after 5 years of infertility struggles. Are you sure you have the right hospital? The nurse asked gently. Maybe your adoption coordinator made a mistake about the location? She specifically said St. Mary's, labor and delivery. Room 304, I replied, checking the text message Maria had sent us 3 hours earlier. Room 304 is a storage closet. We don't use that for patient care. Sarah looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. David, something's wrong. Maria isn't answering her phone. I'd been calling Maria Rodriguez, our adoption coordinator from Happy Family Adoptions, every 15 minutes since arriving at the hospital. Each call went straight to voicemail. Her office phone did the same. The nurse, whose name tag read Jennifer, looked at us with growing concern. How long have you been working with this adoption agency? 8 months, Sarah said. We've paid all the fees, met with the birth mother. Everything was arranged. Do you have documentation from the birth mother's doctor? Hospital pre-registration. Forms? We looked at each other and realized we'd never seen any official medical documentation. Maria had always handled the medical side of the arrangement, claiming that patient privacy laws prevented her from sharing detailed records with us until after the birth. She said it was normal, I explained, that adoptive parents weren't given access to medical records until the baby was born. Jennifer's expression grew more worried. That's not accurate. Legitimate adoption agencies provide extensive medical documentation throughout the pregnancy. Let me call my supervisor. Over the next hour, as hospital staff tried to help us understand what was happening, the scope of our situation became clear. There was no birth mother named Jessica Martinez registered at any hospital in the city. There was no baby expected to be born that night. There was no legitimate adoption arrangement. Maria Rodriguez had disappeared, along with our $50,000 and the dreams we'd built around becoming parents. To understand how we'd been so completely deceived, I need to explain how our adoption journey had begun and why we'd trusted Maria so completely. Sarah and I had been trying to conceive for 5 years when we first consulted Dr. Amanda Thompson, a fertility specialist at Women's Health Associates. After extensive testing, Dr. Thompson explained that Sarah had severe endometriosis. It made natural conception extremely unlikely. Your options are IVF with a relatively low success rate, or adoption, Dr. Thompson had explained. Given the extent of the endometriosis, I'd honestly recommend considering adoption as your primary path to parenthood. The decision to pursue adoption had been emotionally difficult, but ultimately felt right for both of us. We wanted to be parents, and we believed we could provide a loving home for a child, regardless of biological connection. The research phase had been overwhelming. Domestic adoption, international adoption, foster-to-adopt programs, each option had different costs, timelines, and requirements. We'd attended information sessions, read countless books, and talk to other adoptive families. That's how we'd first heard about Happy Family Adoptions. At a support group meeting for perspective, adoptive parents, another couple, the Johnsons, had shared their positive experience with the agency. Maria Rodriguez was incredible, Jennifer Johnson had told the group. She matched us with a birth mother within 3 months, handled all the legal work, and made the whole process feel personal and supportive. What were the costs like? Sarah had asked. About $50,000 total, which included all legal fees, medical expenses for the birth mother, and Maria's coordination services. Expensive, but worth every penny to hold our daughter. The Johnsons showed photos of their 6-month-old daughter, Emma, and talked about how grateful they were for Maria's guidance through what could have been an intimidating process. Based on their recommendation, we'd contacted Happy Family Adoptions and scheduled an initial consultation with Maria at her office in downtown Portland. Maria's office was professional and welcoming, decorated with photos of happy families and thank you letters from satisfied clients. She was 42 years old, had 15 years of experience in adoption services, and spoke with genuine warmth about helping families achieve their dreams. Every adoption is a miracle, she told us during our first meeting. My job is to make sure that miracle happens as smoothly and safely as possible for everyone involved. Maria explained that Happy Family Adoptions specialized in domestic infant adoption, working with birth mothers who had made the difficult decision to place their babies with loving adoptive families. We're selective about the families we work with, she'd said, because we want to ensure the best possible outcomes for the children and birth mothers. Based on your background and what you've shared about your hopes for parenthood, I think we'd be a great fit. The initial paperwork had been extensive, but seemed appropriate for such an important process. Home study evaluations, financial documentation, reference letters, medical clearances, everything you'd expect for a legitimate adoption agency. The average wait time for a match is 4 to 6 months, Maria had explained, but sometimes the right situation comes along more quickly. We'd paid the initial fees, $15,000 for agency services and legal representation, and begun the waiting process that Maria assured us would end with us holding our child. 3 months later, Maria called with news that changed our lives. I have a situation that might be perfect for you, she'd said, barely containing her excitement. 22-year-old birth mother, Jessica Martinez. She's about 12 weeks pregnant, healthy, and specifically looking for a couple like you. Stable, professional, ready to be loving parents. Tell us about her, Sarah had said, putting the call on speaker so we could both participate. Jessica is a college student who made a mistake with her boyfriend. They're not in a position to raise a child, but she wants to make sure the baby goes to a family that can provide everything she can't. She's seen your profile and specifically asked to meet you. A meeting with Jessica had taken place at a coffee shop downtown. She was exactly what Maria had described, young, articulate, and clearly struggling with a difficult decision. She was visibly pregnant, about 20 weeks along according to Maria's timeline. I want you to know this isn't easy for me, Jessica had told us, her hands resting on her rounded belly. But I know I can't give this baby what it deserves, and Maria showed me your profile. You seem like exactly the kind of parents I'd want for my child. Sarah had tears in her eyes throughout the conversation. We promise we'll love this baby completely and raise them to know they were wanted by both their birth mother and their adoptive parents. Jessica had smiled and reached across the table to take Sarah's hand. I can see why Maria thought you'd be perfect. I want to move forward with the adoption. The months that followed had been a mixture of joy, anticipation, and carefully managed anxiety. We'd met with Jessica twice more, always in Maria's presence, and had watched her pregnancy progress. Maria provided regular updates on Jessica's health and the baby's development. Everything looks great, Maria would report after Jessica's prenatal appointments. The baby is measuring perfectly, and Jessica is taking excellent care of herself. We'd prepared our home for the baby's arrival, converting our spare bedroom into a nursery, buying everything a newborn would need, and letting ourselves imagine the family we were about to become. "I can't believe we're finally going to be parents," Sarah had said one evening as we assembled a crib. "After all these years of disappointment, Jessica is giving us the greatest gift imaginable." The financial payments had continued throughout. Jessica's pregnancy, medical expenses, living expenses, legal fees, everything that Maria assured us was normal and necessary for a healthy adoption process. These costs ensure that Jessica can focus on taking care of herself and the baby without worrying about finances. Maria had explained when we'd expressed concern about the mounting expenses. By the time Jessica reached her third trimester, we'd paid nearly $45,000 in various fees and expenses. Maria assured us this was typical for private domestic adoption. "I know it feels like a lot," she'd said, "but remember what you're getting: a healthy baby and the family you've always wanted." Most couples tell me afterward that they would have paid twice as much for this outcome. The call that brought us to the hospital had come exactly when Maria had predicted, based on Jessica's due date. Labor had started. Jessica was asking for used to be there, and we needed to come immediately. "This is it," Sarah had whispered as we drove to the hospital. "In a few hours, we're going to meet our baby." But there was no baby. There was no Jessica. There was no birth. There was only a confused hospital staff, empty maternity rooms, and the gradual realization that we'd been victims of an elaborate fraud. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of Maria's criminal operation and how many other families had suffered the same devastating experience. Working with Detective Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, from the Portland Police Bureau's Fraud Division, we learned that Happy Family Adoptions was not a licensed adoption agency, and that Maria Rodriguez was not her real name. "Her actual name is Maria Santos," Detective Rodriguez explained during our first meeting. "She's a career criminal who's been running adoption fraud schemes in multiple states for over 8 years. How many other families are involved?" We've identified at least 15 couples who paid money to Happy Family Adoptions over the past 2 years. The total amount stolen is approaching $800,000. What about Jessica? Was she involved? Jessica Martinez is an actress Maria hired to play the role of birth mother. She's performed this same role for multiple couples, sometimes simultaneously. She's facing charges for fraud and conspiracy. The revelation that Jessica's pregnancy had been fake was particularly devastating for Sarah. She'd formed an emotional connection with someone she thought was carrying her future child, only to learn that the entire relationship had been a carefully scripted performance. "I felt the baby move," Sarah said through tears during one of our police interviews. "Jessica let me put my hand on her belly and feel kicks." How was that possible if she wasn't really pregnant? Detective Rodriguez explained that Maria's operation was sophisticated and well-rehearsed. Jessica used prosthetic pregnancy bellies that became progressively larger to simulate advancing pregnancy. A movement Sarah felt was created by small devices inside the prosthetic that mimicked fetal activity. "They've perfected this scam over years of practice," Detective Rodriguez said. "Every detail is designed to be completely convincing to couples who are desperate to believe they're finally going to become parents." The investigation also revealed that other couples had been told they were adopting the same baby from the same birth mother. Maria had been running parallel schemes, collecting fees from multiple families for the same non-existent adoption. The Hendersons, who you met at the support group, were also working with Maria, Detective Rodriguez explained. But their adoption happened through a completely different scam. They paid $55,000 for a baby that was supposedly being born in California. At birth never happened either. So the baby they showed us photos of was either adopted through a legitimate agency they don't want to discuss, or the photos were of someone else's child entirely. We're still investigating. The scope of Maria's fraud extended beyond just financial theft. She'd systematically exploited the most vulnerable emotions of couples struggling with infertility, using their desperation to become parents as a weapon against them. These victims are uniquely vulnerable, Detective Rodriguez explained. They've often been trying to conceive for years, may have experienced pregnancy losses, and are emotionally invested in any opportunity to finally become parents. That emotional investment makes them less likely to question inconsistencies or demand verification of claims. The legal proceedings against Maria Santos and her accomplices were complex and emotionally draining. In addition to Jessica, the criminal network included fake attorneys who prepared fraudulent legal documents, fake medical professionals who provided false health reports, and even people who posed as social workers conducting fake home studies. Maria created an entire fictional support system around each adoption, explained Assistant District Attorney Michael Thompson during his prosecution presentation. Victims received phone calls from people claiming to be doctors, lawyers, and social workers, all confirming that their adoption was progressing normally. The trial revealed details about Maria's methods that were both sophisticated and cruel. She studied each couple's background extensively, crafting birth mother profiles that would appeal specifically to their hopes and fears. If a couple had experience pregnancy loss, Maria would create a birth mother story that emphasized how much the fictional birth mother wanted to ensure her baby went to parents who truly understood the preciousness of life, Thompson explained. If a couple was struggling financially to afford adoption, she'd emphasize how the birth mother specifically wanted middle-class parents rather than wealthy ones. Maria was ultimately convicted on 23 counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison in order to pay restitution to her victims. Jessica received 5 years in prison for her role in the scheme, and several other accomplices received sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years. But the criminal convictions provided little comfort to the families whose dreams had been destroyed and whose financial resources had been stolen. The $50,000 we'd paid to Maria represented most of our savings and a substantial loan against our retirement accounts. The restitution ordered by the court was largely symbolic, as Maria had spent or hidden most of the money she'd stolen. More devastating than the financial loss was the emotional trauma of having our hopes for parenthood exploited and manipulated. I don't know if I can trust the adoption process again, Sarah said during one of our counseling sessions. How do we know the next agency is legitimate? How do we protect ourselves from being victimized again? The experience had damaged not just our financial resources, but our ability to hope and trust in ways that would be necessary for successful adoption through legitimate channels. Working with a counselor who specialized in fertility trauma, we began the slow process of rebuilding our emotional foundation and considering our options for the future. What Maria did to you was specifically designed to break your trust in the adoption process, Dr. Jennifer Walsh explained. Part of recovery is learning to distinguish between legitimate agencies and fraudulent operations. Dr. Walsh helped us understand the warning signs we'd missed and the verification steps we should have taken before trusting Maria with our money and dreams. Legitimate adoption agencies are licensed by state authorities, maintain professional memberships, and provide extensive documentation at every step of the process, she explained. They also don't require large upfront payments or rush couples through the matching process. 18 months after Maria's conviction, we felt ready to explore adoption again, but this time with much more careful research and verification. We worked with Oregon's Department of Human Services to understand licensing requirements for adoption. Agencies contacted the Better Business Bureau to verify any agency's reputation, and insisted on meeting with multiple families who had completed adoptions through any agency we considered. The legitimate adoption process that we eventually pursued was different from Maria's operation in every significant way. Real agencies provided extensive documentation, required gradual payments tied to specific milestones, and included multiple safeguards to protect both adoptive families and birth mothers. 2 years after our experience with Maria, we successfully adopted an infant daughter through a licensed agency that followed all legal and ethical protocols. The process was more expensive, more time-consuming, and more emotionally demanding than Maria's fraudulent shortcuts, but it resulted in our daughter Emma coming home with us. The difference between legitimate adoption and fraud is that real agencies are focused on the best interests of children, explained Lisa Chun, our adoption coordinator at Family Connections. Fraudulent operations are focused on extracting money from desperate couples. Emma is now 4 years old, healthy and happy, and completely unaware that her path to our family included a detour through criminal fraud that nearly destroyed our ability to trust the adoption process. The experience with Maria taught us that desperation can make people vulnerable to exploitation, but it also taught us that legitimate paths to parenthood exist for couples willing to do the necessary research and verification. Maria succeeded because she told couples what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. Detective Rodriguez explained during a victim impact presentation she gave after the trial. She promised quick matches, healthy babies, and simple processes because that's what couples struggling with infertility desperately want to believe is possible. The investigation into happy family adoptions led to increased oversight of adoption. Services in Oregon and several other states where Maria had operated. New licensing requirements and mandatory reporting protocols were implemented to make similar fraud schemes more difficult to sustain. But the most important protection for prospective adoptive families remains education about the difference between legitimate and fraudulent adoption services. The couples who avoid adoption fraud are the ones who understand that legitimate adoption is complex, carefully regulated, and designed to protect children rather than generate profits, Lisa Chun explained. Quick solutions and easy processes are almost always signs of fraud rather than legitimate services. 5 years after Maria's conviction, we've maintained contact with several other families who were victimized by her scheme. Some have successfully completed legitimate adoptions. Others have pursued different paths to parenthood, and a few have decided to remain child-free rather than risk being victimized again. The common thread among all of us is that we learned to distinguish between our desire for something to be true and our responsibility to verify that it actually is true. Maria Santos exploited our deepest hopes and most vulnerable emotions. But she also taught us that the most important protection against fraud is the willingness to ask difficult questions, even when you desperately want to believe the answers you're being given. The woman who promised to help us become parents had actually been preventing us from pursuing legitimate adoption while stealing our resources and destroying our trust. Sometimes the people who offer to make your dreams come true are actually the ones trying to profit from your desperation. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your future family is refuse to take shortcuts that seem too good to be true.